all imagine a sound in the background. It is the sound of a US Predator drone in flight, as recorded by the US military and published on the BBC website in 2002. 2 years later, in 2004, Taliban leader Naik Mohammed was sitting with his supporters in a compound on a hot, sweltering June day when he asked if they knew anything about the metallic bird that was hovering over their village. Nearly 24 hours later, he was sitting with those supporters, eating a meal when his satellite phone rang. Moments later, a missile streaked through the compound, killing everyone in the room, including 2 children aged 10 and 16. The Pakistan Army quickly denied that this was an attack by the US, and the US remained silent about its covert drone operation. Residents, however, found shrapnel left behind from the attack, and on them were the words stamped in black, "Made in the USA." This was the first time the unmanned flying vehicle was encountered in South Waziristan, a region in the former federally administered tribal areas of Pakistan. So I'm an anthropologist, and this presentation is going to be about various ethnographic vignettes that I collected during my reporting as a journalist. And this is me witnessing how the war on terror unfolded and the experiences of the people who lived in Fatah and South Waziristan. In 2012, WikiLeaks released a cache of US State Department cables, and most urban Pakistanis found out just how complicit their own government was in the drone attacks on Fatah. This was a period when human rights discourse and counterterrorism had come to mean one and the same thing, but drone warfare appeared to follow none of the established international and ethical norms of war. In 2012, Pakistan's current Prime Minister, at the time an emerging political figure, had led a march against drone strikes with the US-based anti-war group Code Pink. Pier Zubair Shah, a journalist born and raised in Fatah, wrote in 2012 that most Pakistanis encountered and built narratives around the drone by understanding it as an attack on their territorial sovereignty and as a scourge that was targeting innocent civilians. The narrative did not explain why Taliban camps and military checkposts continue to coexist within the proximity. A resident of South Waziristan then told me, "We have been telling people since the very beginning that the army and Taliban protect each other. The only time Taliban chiefs were killed were through drone strikes. The military operations under the war on terror unleashed even more terror on the people of Fatah." So between recognizing the need to take out the Taliban, who were viewed as outsiders, and battling the so-called most efficient way to take them out, the residents of South Waziristan lived through the extension of colonial surveillance and violence. Missing from the dominant narratives were the experiences of life under the constant presence of drones. So why and how did Fatah become the testing ground for one of the most celebrated humane forms of warfare? Fatah has been a containment zone for over 100 years, constructed as a buffer to protect the empire, and dissected and ordered spatially through military infrastructures, checkpoints, and militias tied to whoever occupied the government at the center. Fanon tells us that colonial occupation entails division of space through boundaries and internal frontiers characterized by barracks and security infrastructures. In 1915, aircraft was first used for British Imperial frontier policing in the regions that now comprise Fatah, in ways that exposed the targeted populations to particular forms of confinement, bombardment, and physical force, as it aimed alternatively to deter and to persuade subjects in order to maintain control. The purpose was to quell rebellions against the empire, and at the same time construct an imagined geography that would serve as a buffer zone between British India and Afghanistan and extend indirect colonial rule. The idea and violence of encountering an unidentified flying object is both awe-inspiring and dreadful and needs to be made sense of. As a journalist covering residents' experiences of the war on terror, I wondered what these encounters with drones had entailed. Many of the people I interviewed thought initially that the drone was a metal bird or it had hailed the day of judgment. It was when the shrapnel carrying the words "Made in USA" were found that drone strikers came to be read as an act of war against Pashtuns. It was the women in my area who were using the word bhangana for the drone, a journalism student in Lahore told me. It means something that follows you around, producing an annoying bee-like sound. Women also used the word to identify harassers, catcallers. The Taliban too used the word Bangada for drones. Locals who opposed the Taliban preferred the word ababil, a bird mentioned in the Quran that was sent by God to defend the holy city of Mecca from invaders by hurling stones from its mouth at the approaching enemy. The journalism student quoted here told me that because there was regular electricity outage in his town, most people slept outdoors at night, especially when it was warm. It is a harrowing experience to sleep under an open sky that becomes contracted and crystallized in an object that just won't shut up. Another resident of South Waziristan told me, many people in my town did not know the difference between a drone or a fighter jet. I myself did not know of drones. A lot of people during this time built these small basements or hidden caves in the mountains nearby. The women from my family thought missiles fired were thunder from sky sent by God. Abdul Wahab's paternal uncle had a big house in Vana, the largest town in South Waziristan, where he would often host gatherings of friends, neighbors, and important members of the area. People would come and go, and it was always bustling with activity. After the first drone strike that occurred near Vana in 2004, the gatherings became less frequent and his uncle started getting ill. Actually, he would fall sick every time there was a drone around. Whenever he heard the sound, he would go to his room and say he was feeling unwell. Furthermore, he was well off financially, so that made him a target for the Taliban, who were running a successful extortion racketeering operation in the area. The Taliban never called what they were doing extortion. Instead, they would ask for offerings and charity, funds given away willingly, but under the threat of murder, kidnapping, and physical violence. Shortly after the drone attack that killed Taliban chief Maulvi Nazir on January 2, 2013, a Taliban commander showed up at Abdul Wahab's uncle's house one evening to ask for his contribution in exchange for protection. Shortly after he walked in, they heard the low buzz of a drone. It must have been following the commander. Wahab's uncle began to panic and begged him to leave, but the commander refused. He felt sick and went to his room and asked his family members in the house to ask the commander to leave. But then the buzz got louder. The drone was now hovering over his own house. Panic turned into cold fear, and he stopped in his tracks. His blood pressure plummeted, and he fainted. Drones, as they were deployed in Fatah, were capable of containerizing space through the auditory experience of encountering the drone. The visceral encounter with an unidentified flying object, the Reaper drone, that flies above the line of visibility but is detectable through its signature sound, allows for an embodied violence that reworks space and time through anticipation, fear, and resonance. Since residents of Fatah did not have access to knowledge about where drones would attack, nor could they see them all the time, they relied on auditory information to find their way when the drones came. More so than the Hellfire missiles that hit seconds before they hit their target in a way that the target never hears their own death approaching, the low frequency hum and buzz of the drone blankets the containment zone with the promise of waiting death. In her book, The Body in Pain, Elaine Scarry frames nuclear warfare as immoral, arguing around notions of consent in war. Framed as an act of torture, what then differentiates nuclear warfare from drone attacks, alongside the spectacular nature of the former, is the outrage and fear that nuclear war generates, while the latter is celebrated instead as humane war. Because the drone as weapon offers the sovereign distance and immunity from death, we note with Scarry that the most radical act of distancing resides in his disclaiming of the other's hurt. You probably can't hear the sound in this video, but this is a video I shot from using my phone. It was at a rally held in Lahore by the Pashtun Tahafuz movement, translated Pashtun Protection Movement. Elaine Scarry says that although the torturer dominates the prisoner both in physical acts and verbal acts, ultimate domination requires that the prisoner's ground become increasingly physical and the torturers increasingly verbal. That the prisoner become a colossal body with no voice and the torturer a colossal voice, a voice composed of two voices with no body. At this rally that, the video that you just saw, Ali Wazir, who is now a sitting member of parliament and a leader of the Pashtun protection movement, said, "We want to show to the people of Lahore the wounds of those hidden behind the mountains of Fatah." The movement began in 2017 in response to extrajudicial killings of young Pashtun men by the police in Karachi. Targeted as terrorists in their own hometowns and later in the spaces they had fled to, the generation of Pashtuns that grew up in the shadow of drones is speaking back. As I filmed this poor quality video on my Android phone, PTM members were flying their own camera drones, capturing videos and evidence of the massive gathering in an historic public ground in Lahore. Elaine Scarry reminds us, these other acts that restore the voice become not only a denunciation of the pain, but almost a diminution of the pain, a partial reversal of the process of torture itself, and reminds us of the healing possibilities of speaking and verbalizing pain.